joining us for this short series of recordings on abuse prevention. In these recordings, we provide a brief overview of effective child abuse prevention and Oregon's unique infrastructure that's helping to make abuse and violence prevention possible. This is episode 3 of 3, building on the frameworks for prevention that we discussed in episode 1 and the focus on addressing the root causes in episode 2. This episode explores how we better promote health and safety in our prevention efforts. For more resources on this and preventing multiple forms of violence and abuse across the lifespan, please visit SATF's website or reach out to our prevention team. Today, you are hearing the voices of 2 of SATF's prevention team. I am Nicole Cunningham, Abuse Prevention Coordinator at SATF, and my pronouns are she and hers.
And I'm Meg Foster, Prevention Program Coordinator at the Sexual Assault Task Force, and I use she, her pronouns as well.
Before we get started here, we just want to make a quick note regarding some symbols that you are going to see throughout the presentation. So these recordings are supported by a wealth of resources created in partnership with multidisciplinary preventionists across the state. One of those is our comprehensive prevention toolkit, which you may have access to the toolkit either in the digital version that you can find on our website under our prevention resources page, or you might have it as a print copy. Throughout these episodes, you'll see a small teal block in the lower right corner. This refers to a page in the Comprehensive Prevention Toolkit, and we encourage you to follow along. We also want to connect you to other amazing resources that our colleagues in the anti-violence and abuse prevention communities have created. So we've included some of those throughout these recordings and highlighted them using this little yellow light bulb symbol. Thank you again for joining us. We're so excited to be doing this work with you.
So to jump in, one of the things that I think that we're really good about in our work is talking about what abuse is. It's a lot easier to talk about what, abuse looks like, what dynamics of abuse are, like all of those pieces around like what violence is. Less common, are we great at talking about what abuse isn't? And so wanted to start off with kind of these reframes of the power and control wheel, which is something we use in the domestic and sexual violence movement a lot, but just offering that it's important for us to balance the what not to do with what we want to do, what we want our communities to look like. What are our visions for healthier and safer communities for all? And as a reminder from the first 2 recordings, all of these different forms of violence and abuse across the lifespan are connected. And so if we are doing our child abuse and neglect prevention work meaningfully and effectively, we're actively overlapping with different forms of violence and abuse that might be occurring at the same time, but may also occur in the future. And so thinking about how our work is deeply connected, and one of the strings that we can connect across all of these different forms of violence and abuse is health promotion, because we want to be working towards our visions of healthier and safer communities for all people, and child abuse and neglect prevention doesn't exist in a silo.
With that, so we want to really focus on this idea that healthy sexuality promotion is necessary to prevent child abuse. Promoting sexual health is preventing sexual violence. Thus, we address the same toxic social norms and rules in both. These unhealthy rules include rigid gender roles, which commodify women and entitle men to non-consensual sex, and community norms that make sex, including discussion and education, a source of shame to be hidden and avoided. By contrast, promoting the language and practice of healthy sexuality supports positive norms and practices that include gender and health equity and prevention of all forms of sexual violence. This is especially relevant to the child sexual abuse prevention, which is often at the forefront of abuse prevention efforts. Putting back on my Child Protective Services caseworker hat from last episode, I can recall a number of instances where young people were unable to access help for a few reasons. One, they told someone, but the language that they used was something that wasn't recognized as a concern for sexual abuse. Think of use of the word cookie instead of anatomically correct language. 2, maybe they were ashamed to talk about what happened. 3, they didn't have the information they needed to be able to tell that what was happening to them wasn't okay, partially due to the lack of conversation about what is okay. There's a misconception that talking about sexuality with young people is going to make them engage in sex or somehow impact things like virtue and purity and innocence. These ideas equate value to sexual acts and cause shame when a young person experiences something sexual, even if it was non-consensual and was actually abuse.
Those are such great examples. And going back to that slide of, the different forms of violence and abuse across the lifespan, we often think about prevention of each of these issues as looking very unique. And that's not necessarily the case, because if we understand the root causes to be the same, and we understand that our visions for a healthier community and healthier future are the same, then we can find where we overlap and where our work ends up looking very similar, regardless of who we're working with. And one of the key tools that crosses all of these forms of violence and abuse and crosses across the lifespan is comprehensive sexuality education. And so we wanted to offer just some research and data on how effective comprehensive sexuality education is at preventing multiple forms of violence and abuse. And so one study called 3 Decades of Research, the Case for Comprehensive Sex Education, showed that comprehensive sexuality education increased awareness of laws. It reduced intimate partner violence. It improved skills and handling of feelings of anger and, empathy and those pieces. It increased knowledge of who to report abuse to and increased parent-child communication about child sex abuse. It also promoted more inclusive and safer communities and safety for LGBTQ+ and trans students and other students. There are lots of outcomes here, and I don't want to dive too far into each of them, but I do want to note that this research also showed that there is substantial evidence that sexuality education is most effective when begun early and before sexual activity begins. And again, I want to remind you, this idea of talking about child abuse and talking about sex and sexuality can feel really disconnected or foreign, but we know through multiple research studies over lots and lots of years that comprehensive sexuality education absolutely prevents not just child sex abuse, but absolutely can prevent child abuse, neglect, all of those other pieces, including some of the examples that Nicole shared, but also those pieces of increasing parent-child communication. If you remember from the first recording, one of the things we talked about was connectedness to caring adults was a protective factor, right? There's so much opportunity here. I wanted to offer another research study that was done. This was a meta-analysis, if you are a data nerd, where they looked at lots of different studies. And what they found is that our national sex ed standards, so across the country, encompass child sex abuse prevention components, which we do here in Oregon as well, with the inclusion of Erin's Law with our comprehensive sexuality education law. And that these efforts not only help children recognize signs of abuse, name their body parts correctly, and communicate with trusted adults about perceived or real danger, but that these can really affect not just child sexual abuse, but show reductions in sexual violence perpetration, have, lower acceptance of violence, decrease early sexual initiation, which is something I know a lot of folks are worried about, and decrease delinquency and empathetic deficits. So all of these pieces are connected, which is why when we say, healthy sexuality promotion is necessary to prevent child abuse, there's a lot of research that shows that that is the case. And we want to spend some time today talking about what that actually means for our work in the child abuse prevention sector.
So what does it mean when we are saying that we need to promote what is healthy? Well, this means going beyond telling people what not to do and instead offering healthy alternatives. How do we build friendships and communication skills instead of only focusing on the impacts of bullying? How do we create cultures where people grow up to understand consent, boundaries, and how to access support and resources rather than creating a culture of fear and shame around things like connection, intimacy, and sexuality? These things are shifts toward positive approaches that include autonomy and skill building rather than things like unquestioning obedience and power over versus power with. These are really critical pieces of comprehensive sexuality education. We're not just talking about education that has to do with sex and reproduction, right? We're looking at social emotional learning components, things that help us to be better friends, better partners as we grow up, better parents if we choose to have children of our own, and really allow us to build out empathy and respect and boundaries and all these different pieces that not only give us better relationship skills, healthy relationship skills, but that set us up for interacting with others and with the world that we live in a way that's less likely to cause harm. So on the next slide here, I want to just draw our attention to some of the overlap that exists currently to show us how health fits into abuse prevention in Oregon. So let's look at this Venn diagram here, where you've got three connecting circles, where we have sexual violence prevention on the top left, sexual health promotion on the top right, and child sex abuse prevention in the bottom left. These prevention goals are the goals of the 2006 recommendations to prevent sexual violence in Oregon, which is a plan of action written by a collaborative to provide Oregon with a statewide prevention plan. The healthy sexuality piece of things, these are the goals of the Oregon Youth Sexual Health Plan. So when we're looking at this diagram, we can see that there are components of each of these different approaches that overlap and that create shared goals that can help us understand some of the places where our work intersects with each other. So for example, if you look at the orange circle or the orange oval, if you will, in the middle of these three circles, we'll see goals such as promoting the status of all genders. Every family has access to and ability to utilize formal services and supports without the fear of stigma, and all children have positive parenting experiences. So we can see that, maybe not every one of these goals overlaps with the work that, is a goal for the other circles. What's important is that a lot of it does overlap, and there are places where we can plug into, really help inform how we achieve these goals together, knowing that working together will not only create more comprehensive outcomes, but will help us get to a place of health and safety faster and more effectively.
Yeah, and I think one thing to note, thinking about these overlapping forms of violence and abuse as well, is that right now, these circles are separate but overlapping, right? But I would argue that if we are really doing our work well in communities throughout Oregon, all of these circles become one, because things that are maybe not currently existing in the child abuse prevention circle or the sexual health promotion circle, that those are deeply impacted by the things in the other circles. It's just our work as it is currently kind of allocated in the state, how it currently plays out in our communities, separates these out in these circles. But to do this meaningfully, to do this effectively, I would argue that all of these circles become one, and that these are all deeply connected with each other and are a part of our visions for healthier and safer communities for all folks here in Oregon. With that in mind, it's important for us to ask the question, what is healthy sexuality? Nicole alluded to some of these pieces in what she was talking about with the Venn diagram of things like consent and boundary settings and, healthy relationships, healthy friendships, all of those pieces. When I talk about what healthy sexuality is, I really like to use this resource called the Sexuality. It was created by Unhushed, and it's pronounced metrosexual. It's available for free online if you Google Sexuality. And if you are following along in the toolkit, you can find this on page 36. So the Sexuality, they offer us 3 different levels in which we experience, learn about, and understand our sexuality. So the intimate level, this usually refers to us personally. So like, how do we experience sexuality? How do we understand and learn about sexuality? Those pieces. These are the leaves of our tree. These often change and grow over time and maybe change seasonally, right? These change regularly and are always, adding new information, etc. The relational level, these are our deep personal relationships, whether this is partners or friends or family members or whomever we are in close connection with. And this is the trunk of our tree. This is a structure upon which those intimate experiences and understandings are founded and spring out of. This also can change over time, but it's often slower change and takes longer for that change to happen. And then they offer us the cultural level. So these are the roots of our trees. These are deeply rooted. They can be changed, but are more difficult to change. But these are these broader contexts, the things that uphold our relational and intimate levels that inform how we experience, how we understand, how we express sexuality. And so they offer us these different levels in which we interact with sexuality on a personal, individual level, right? And then they offer us these 45 different items to think about how they may apply to our sexuality. So, for example, consent down here at number 9. How do we experience, learn about, understand consent as it applies to our sexuality? How does that fit into our sexuality? Is this something that is just on a personal level? Is this something that we learned about or we experience or we understand just on a relational level? Is there a broader context around consent that is informing our understandings and our experiences of sexuality? And so they ask us to take each of these items and think about where they might fit on our tree. And full disclosure, the last time that I did this, the sexuality, pretty much all of these things went in all 3 levels on my tree. But I'm pretty confident that even if you did the same thing where everything went at every level, the reasoning why you put it at that level would be different than the reasoning why I put it at that level. And one of the reasons I really like the sexuality is it helps us understand that we all experience, express, learn about, and understand what is healthy sexuality differently. So what healthy sexuality looks like for me is going to be different than what healthy sexuality looks like for you. Almost every time I've ever done this resource, there folks have had questions about what some of these words mean, like skin hunger is the most common one that folks ask questions about, which is a desire for physical contact, which may not be sexual, right? That might be platonic. Like, I just really want a hug right now from someone that I care about versus like, I want to have sex right now. Those are very different things. But skin hunger can really apply to that really like platonic, like, I want to hold your hand, or I want you to play with my hair, those things of like, I just want some positive physical touch right now. Another thing that often comes up is what's not here that should be here. And some of the big examples I get are things like kink is not on this list, where then a lot of people often say, but fetishes, so isn't that covered? Which the answer is no, because fetish and kink are very different things. And you may not have those things on your tree at all, or you may have both, or you may have one, right? That it's important that our understandings of healthy sexuality are different. Another one that comes up as well is either faith or spirituality. Religion is on here, but a lot of people experience those things in very different ways, and how those impact their sexuality is different. So when it comes to what we mean by healthy sexuality, it's different for all of us. And sometimes that can feel a little overwhelming. But what that does is help us understand better ways to promote health and safety for all people. If we're saying this is the only formula or this is the only answer to being healthy, we are inevitably going to miss people, because your definition of healthy sexuality, your definition of health is going to be different than mine, and what that looks like and how that plays out in our experiences and in our lives. So what is our goal? What is our goal when it comes to abuse prevention, when it comes to sex and sexuality? I have asked this question so many times and pretty consistently get answers along the lines of, I want people to, grow up and be healthy and safe and not experience abuse. I want people to thrive. I want people to have access to joy. I have never once, in asking that question, had somebody say, I want people to not abuse people, which can be a part of our goals, right? But it's never what comes to mind for folks initially with this question. Additionally, I've never once had someone say, I want people to obey the law, which I think is interesting because absolutely laws exist, and a lot of them are well intentioned to help protect people and some of our more vulnerable folks, like young folks. A lot of our laws are rooted in harm, like some of the sodomy laws in Oregon, which were created to restrict what was considered gay behavior, but was really targeting the LGBTQ plus and trans community. And we use it a lot in our abuse investigation and in abuse services world today. And so, right, like understanding that laws sometimes were designed to intentionally cause harm is really important to note. But let's just focus on those laws that are, you know, well intentioned, meant to help keep people safe. That's great. That is an important piece of this, but that also doesn't get at our goal of people having healthy, safe, thriving lives. It's a really low bar. That we just don't want people to break the law is a low bar. It doesn't get at that goal of like health and safety for all people in our communities. And so I like us to just think about this because so often in our prevention efforts in particular, we lead with the law or we end at the law. We say, this is what the law says. And if that's not necessarily our goal, if our goal is we want people to obey the law, but we also want people to thrive and be healthy and safe and in, you know, live lives that are full of joy and, you know, the wholeness of our humanity, just starting and ending at the law isn't going to get us there. So I like to just note that when we think about what it means to really promote what is healthy. And I also just want to note that the image on this slide is an example of what not to do in terms of promoting what is healthy. This is the wheel of consequences, and it says at the bottom, you don't want to spin, choose abstinence. And the reason why I say this is an example of what not to do is that there is a lot of shame and fear and stigma tied to this wheel. So there's a very small sliver there that says none. So if you engage in sexual activity, there's a 1 in like 15 chance that there will be no consequences. But then there are things like you'll lose your friends, you'll get HIV, you'll have emotional damage. My favorite here is no job. If you have sex, you will not have a job. Which, to put this into a little bit of context, this was hanging in a middle school classroom that I used to teach in. So can you imagine being a 7th grader and being like, if I have sex, I'm not going to have a job? Which is fascinating because there are a lot of people who are, you know, in this case, we're talking about adults who have sex that have jobs. So I'm very confused about the messaging there. But I think it's important to note, again, like if our goal is that people are healthy and safe and thriving, that they're able to set healthy boundaries, that they're able to promote consent, they're able to have, you know, access to positive friendships and avoid bullying and, you know, have safe usage of technology and the internet and all those pieces. This sort of messaging doesn't get us there. If anything, it just scares us and doesn't give us the tools or the skills to navigate health and safety for ourselves.
Thank you so much for all that grounding, Meg. Absolutely critical pieces here to understand what we're talking about, understand the components of healthy sexuality, and to really, you know, dive into these pieces of what are we talking about and how are we framing these things in the context of abuse prevention. In this next section here, we want to really dive into some health promotion skills that are going to be useful in helping us to achieve this goal of healthier and safer communities for all people in a world where, you know, all of us can be authentic and feel empowered to, you know, have autonomy and power over what happens to us in our lives. So this list here of health promotion skills. So we start out with promote healthy norms and skills, and then we're going to look at openness, honesty, and authenticity in our conversations and in the information that we, you know, are working with and providing. And then we're going to come back to thinking about positive framing. as all three of these things are a great way to really shift the narrative around some of this fear and shame that we often see as the guiding narrative in a lot of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nicole. And especially, I like that last piece you said there on the fear and shame that often guides us, especially thinking about in the last recording, talking about addressing the root causes, the ways in which we might unintentionally reinforce harm and unintentionally uphold pillars of violence and abuse when we are trying to prevent it. That positive reframing and health promotion in general can help us get out of those patterns. So let's jump into this first one, promote healthy norms and skills. So what does that mean? There are a couple pieces we want to highlight. One of those is access to comprehensive and medically accurate age-appropriate information for all. So I don't know, some of you may be medical professionals, most of you likely aren't. And so thinking about what resources we can tap into that are medically accurate, that do provide that really appropriate, age appropriate, but also accurate information can be really meaningful. Oregon is one of only 13 states in the country at the time of this recording that requires our sex education to be medically accurate, which I think is important because, as Nicole highlighted, and we're going to talk a little bit more, like being able to name our body parts is an important tool in getting help for things that are happening to our body parts, right? And so having that information, having the tools and the skills to talk about our bodies, some body literacy is really meaningful. Also, I think this one is important because whether we're doing response work or prevention work, we have a lot of missed opportunities here. And so, for example, imagine that we are, supporting a young person who has experienced sex abuse. We miss an opportunity to counteract narratives of sex abuse with messaging around like what is healthy sexuality, those pieces of like, well, this was abuse, so what does healthy look like? How can you navigate this the rest of your life? And you don't, we're not saying that all of you are responsible for all things all the time, but how can we start folks off on a good path with tools and skills to then navigate what is healthy and safe for them longer term, not just in this moment. And so like we can interrupt abuse, but we also want to like lay that groundwork and connect people to resources and tools and information that can help them navigate this beyond just this moment with those of us in this room. Providing information on health and gender equity is also really important. Remember, in the last recording, we talked about addressing the root causes. Equity is a tool that we can work towards in order to interrupt and dismantle systems and structures of oppression. And so looking for, what are the ways in which we're restricting access to health and healthiness? One example might be the ways in which ageism plays out and young people being able to have a voice in in their own health and what happens to their bodies long term, right? It's one thing to be like, you get to say what happens to your body, but then also like until you're a certain age, your parents get to decide every sort of healthcare that you access. That's a conflicting message for a young person. Like you're in charge of your body and also your parents get to say what happens to your body and your health medically. Very confusing. Similarly, we know that young people, particularly young folks who are part of the LGBTQ plus and trans communities, experience higher rates of discrimination in our local schools and in other spaces. And so if we are not supporting and offering messaging services and, inclusive information, we're unintentionally upholding violence and abuse towards some young people and not towards others, which is a really important thing if our goal is to prevent child abuse or another form of violence and abuse. So how are we providing information on health and gender equity? How are we talking about consent as pleasure focused and not fear driven? This is a little bit of a going back to that law is a low bar. So often I hear folks talk about consent as like, consent is a requirement so we don't assault people. Like this is how you don't commit sexual violence, which is true. But again, if our goal is that people are thriving and are healthy and safe, maybe consent lets us, navigate our boundaries. Maybe consent lets us, communicate more effectively. Maybe consent is a meaningful way to have healthy relationships with our friends and our peers and our family members. And so what are the ways in which we're only talking about consent from this really low bar and often fear-driven place? Language to talk about relationships and sex is both normal and pleasurable. I know I've said the P word, pleasure, a couple times now, and I know that makes a lot of us really uncomfortable. And I know that this takes practice. We're asking generations of people who were taught to be uncomfortable talking about sex to all of a sudden be comfortable talking about it, and it's not going to happen overnight. We have to practice this in consensual ways, preferably. But looking for those spaces to really talk about this as normal and pleasurable, that our experiences, our body literacy, our, questions about what we're experiencing, what, is going on in our brains and in our hearts and in our bodies is really important for us to be able to navigate and talk about in really normal ways. Otherwise, again, we miss that opportunity to promote that vision of healthier and safer communities for all people. Instead, we're just saying, you should be healthy and safe, but I'm not going to give you any resources or tools to figure out what that means for you in any sort of normalized way. So again, language to talk about this in really meaningful ways is really huge. And then recognizing that not everyone experiences and expresses sexuality in the same way is really important. And we talked about that with the sexuality, but my healthy sexuality is not your healthy sexuality. And so how can we uplift the skills to navigate what is healthy for us and not just, all try and fit into this one box. And so these are just some examples. And we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this using Oregon's health education standards and performance indicators.
Yeah, so as Meg said, here we've pulled a few of the health education standards that exist here in Oregon. And as Meg also said earlier, Oregon's really unique in that there's been a lot of work done to try and align Oregon's education standards with things like Erin's Law and the Healthy Teen Relationship Act, which are really crucial pieces of legislation for preventing child abuse here in the state. So we're going to walk through some examples here of different standards and then give some context about how those things directly connect to abuse prevention. So on this first slide here, we are looking at a kindergarten standard that says, recognize everyone has the right to say who touches their body, when, and how. So we can understand that this is super helpful because it helps kids recognize physical and sexual abuse when someone is touching them without their permission, as well as that it's not okay to touch someone else without their permission, which is a skill to prevent further perpetration. The really important thing to think about here with these social emotional learning components of healthy sexuality education is that we are not just focused on preventing the experience of abuse, right? We want to really ensure that we are giving our young people in this state the tools that they need to not perpetrate harm going forward, or be the person who causes harm or perpetrates abuse to someone else in their life that they care about, or that they encounter intentionally or unintentionally, right? The second standard on this slide that we want to talk about is this piece of identifying healthy ways to express needs, wants, and feelings. We can see that this helps children communicate a need for help if something isn't okay, like they're experiencing abuse or neglect. This helps people as they grow to prevent other forms of violence by cultivating healthy communication skills and promoting self-advocacy.
Yeah, a couple more examples here as well. Another kindergarten one, name reproductive body parts using proper anatomical terms and stages in the basic growth processes of all people. So what this means when we say it's a kindergarten standard, like the last two, is that this is supposed to be taught in kindergarten. And it's not just kindergarten alone, like we build on these skills across the health education standards, but it's important to start at least in kindergarten. And, we do a lot of work with college and university campuses and adults in our communities as well. And at this point, I would argue that most adults and most folks that are going into college haven't received this type of education. And so these apply across the lifespan as well, not just with, kindergartners. So the importance of naming reproductive body parts helps kids communicate clearly about their bodies, and when something is harming a specific part of their body, or when something doesn't feel good, or when something feels really good, and we want to like lean into an activity, a sport, art, right? Like this is a way for us to say like something feels good or something feels bad. It also fosters communication skills to navigate physical health throughout our lives, which, as an adult human who did not learn body literacy growing up, I can say that, like, talking about what's going on with my body as I get older and more things fall apart is not a skill that I learned how to do. And so it's taken me a lot longer to access, healthcare when something is wrong because I'm like, it'll go away, and then like 6 months later, why is this still happening? And so the body literacy piece, like this applies throughout our whole lives. Similarly, this is a 12th grade standard. So in high school, demonstrate on anatomical models or list the steps for how to perform breast, testicular, and genital self-exams. Again, this helps young people learn additional ways to take care of their bodies, recognize when something might be wrong, and identify signs to seek help, especially if unhealthiness is exacerbated by neglect, abuse, or violence. If somebody's experience growing up is one of neglect or abuse, and they don't have the tools to name that, or haven't been, haven't had the opportunity to explore what healthy relationships, families, etc., might look like, they may not know that something is wrong, right? And so understanding our bodies and understanding what's going on with us is a really important skill and tool to help us interrupt neglect and abuse.
And we're going to continue here. We've got a few more that we really want to highlight because it's so important to make these connections to abuse prevention. So on this next slide, the first one is a fifth grade standard. As Meg said, it doesn't mean that, it's only fifth grade specific, but this means that it's important to start this conversation at least at that point. So this one, demonstrate effective ways to communicate personal boundaries and show respect for the boundaries of others. So this one's huge, right? It helps kids communicate clearly about their own boundaries and when someone is violating those boundaries. This also helps kids learn that they can't violate other people's boundaries, which is preventing potential perpetration of abuse down the line. This one is really important for conversation to be paired with effective ways to handle and mitigate anger or, out the feelings that maybe come up when someone is violating our boundaries. This is something that we often see with young people who get into physical fights or, there are concerns for, violence happening in schools. And the question a lot of the time is, did they do something to deserve that response, right? And we need to shift that narrative. The response of violence isn't something that people deserve, right? It's a conversation about how do we think about the boundaries that we have, understand when we've made someone uncomfortable, understand when someone has made us uncomfortable, and then communicate about those things in a way that is nonviolent and in a way that promotes autonomy, decision-making, and respect for each other. The second one here on this slide is an eighth grade standard, and it says demonstrate effective skills to negotiate agreements about the use of technology in relationships. So this one is huge. Putting back on my CPS hat, this was the number one question I got from parents was, what do I do about technology? What do I do about social media? And the answer was, I'm not entirely sure, right? Because it's unique and specific to your family and to your young person and to their experience of technology and understanding safety when it comes to literacy and all of those things, right? So this skill is meant to help children recognize potential dangers online and develop the skills that they need to navigate technology, things like texting, things like social media in a safe and healthy way, when they're older, but also in the moment, right? This is an eighth grade standard. We know that means that everyone who gets this education at this time is more than likely already experiencing technology, right? So not only are we trying to set up a foundation where we can use technology safely going forward, but how do we manage technology, think about boundaries, understand potential for danger, and really talk about those things in a way that isn't just don't get on social media, don't use your phone, don't do those things, because we know that's not the solution. I can tell you from experience with families, that is not the solution. young people are going to use technology. They're going to use it. They're going to find ways to. So we have to talk about how to do so safely.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Nicole. And also recognizing that like so much of our like professional world is rooted in technology today. And so if our response to young people accessing technology is like, this is bad, don't do it. Like think of the ways that like all the ways throughout our lives across all those pieces across the lifespan that we're actually setting young people up to not be successful. That piece around promoting health and safety across the lifespan, that we have such an opportunity to foster skills in this way, not just like how are you individually accessing the internet, but how are you navigating this in your relationships? How are you navigating this with your partners, your friends, your parents? All of these pieces over time, right? And then how are you using these things for work?
Definitely. And I think yeah, work and school, absolutely. One other piece here that I think is super important is this helps us to, open up that conversation about things like sexting, things like sending naked pictures of yourself to, another young person or to whatever it looks like, right? Oftentimes that conversation is had in the context of, well, it's against the law or that's child pornography. And we know that it's a way more nuanced conversation than that, right? Our young people need to understand not just the pieces around like ramifications for sending pictures and sexting and all of that, but they also need to understand how to use these tools in their relationships, in their, just like Meg was saying, in their romantic connections, in a way that's going to set them up for success, in a way that's going to keep them safe, and in a way that allows them to feel more in control of what's happening with their technology than they would if we just pretend like it's not happening.
Let's do two more real quick. This one here is a third grade standard. Recognize sources of medically accurate information about human sexual and reproductive anatomy, puberty, and personal hygiene, which helps kids understand accurate information about their bodies and various behaviors. Remember those first examples of how to promote sexual health is that access to medically accurate information that's age appropriate is really important. And this increases their ability to find and utilize accurate sources of support if something is wrong and or figure out where to start seeking help. This piece around accessing information, especially tied to the technology conversation that Nicole was just having with you all, is very much, right? Like we need to have tools to know what information is accurate, right? Like we need to know what sources of information are useful and meaningful and accurate and appropriate for us, right? And so helping people learn how to recognize accurate information is really valuable because otherwise we end up down so many rabbit holes that aren't actually going to help us or might mislead us.
And I would love to add to that piece, Meg, that there's also a real reality that we are living in at this time in our lives, right? At the time of this recording, there's a nationwide conversation happening about fake news, false information, accurate information, and how to really vet sources and understand where something is coming from, understand the perspective, the intention, the bias that, accompanies the messaging you're receiving. And I think if we start that conversation here, what is this, the third grade standard you said? Think about how powerful that is and how much better off we as adults would be navigating this current climate that we're in if we had been taught information that helps us to recognize accuracy, not just about medical information. This can be extrapolated to think about accuracy of sources just in general. And it really, to me, feels like something that would be beneficial for a lot of us who are really struggling to know what to think of a lot of the information that we're getting right now.
Absolutely. That is such an important point. And, I think about us as adults, and there's always the joke as well about like, let me Google my symptoms and see what like life ending disease I have, right? And this piece of like, who are the people that we should be accessing? What are the sources of information we should be accessing? Is it really the most beneficial to be like, I have this rash and enter that into, Google and find out that we're like dying immediately, right? Like that we want to cultivate an environment where young people and all people are getting answers to the questions that they have about their lives, their bodies, their sexuality, their existence in really meaningful ways. So the last example we want to offer here is a seventh grade standard, which is analyze influences that may have an impact on deciding whether and when to engage in sexual behaviors. There has been extensive research done throughout the United States, and what they found is that abstinence-only education doesn't actually work. In places where abstinence-only education occurs, we see increases in teen pregnancy, we see increases in STIs and STDs. And so having conversations with folks about whether and when to engage in sexual behaviors, and there are so many factors to bring into that, right? Those influences are really important. And particularly when we're thinking about abuse prevention, this can help children and young people learn about pressures from adults in their lives, peers and others, around sex and sexuality, or keeping secrets, or some of those other pieces, right? That like, this is weird, or this is influencing me or pressuring me in a weird way. And when to seek support if someone is pressuring them to engage in abusive behaviors, or if someone is pressuring them to not tell about those abusive behaviors. Yeah, Nicole.
I think it's a really useful, I thank you for letting me jump in here. I think it's a really useful piece too when we're thinking about abuse prevention to also tie this directly back to commercial and sexual exploitation of children and trafficking, right? Because this is such an important piece of how young people oftentimes end up in situations where they are being trafficked or they're experiencing sexual exploitation. Well, a lot of that starts with, community seeking, looking for supports, accessing resources, trying to find places where they feel seen and valued. And, that's something that's exploited frequently by people who are looking to traffic or, exploit young people. And so this piece of understanding influence and understanding intention is really critical when we're hoping to set our young people up with the tools to think critically about what someone is offering them when it comes to these different pieces of, not just support, but also sexuality, right? There's a lot of really complicated components young people have to navigate when someone is pressuring them or when they are kind of on the cusp of being pulled into some of that CSEC trafficking concern, right? So I just wanted to connect us back to that specifically because it's such a really important topic in the child abuse prevention world, and I think one that has to be partnered directly with this conversation about health promotion.
Thank you, Nicole. And that also kind of leads into that last little point there. If it helps young people delay sexual activities until they're ready. And just going back to this piece of what is our goal? And if our goal is that all people, especially young people, are thriving and having healthy and safe lives throughout their entire lives, being able to navigate and understand sex and sexuality and delay those behaviors until people feel ready themselves is a really empowering and meaningful way of doing this work, as opposed to, again, going to that low bar of the law of like, you can't have sex until you're 18, which doesn't actually give us the skills or tools to decide what beyond 18, even like when is the right time for us to engage in sexual activity, or maybe when is there a right time to engage in abstinence, even if we've already engaged in sexual behavior. And so there's so much opportunity that we miss by just, defaulting to, well, this is what the law says, so don't do that. Which is where the next health promotion skill comes in. And this is openness, honesty, and authenticity. And a good example of this is in our conversations. So we want to start by thinking about how we are talking about sex and sexuality in meaningful ways. And a question that I think is really important for us to consider is, what does healthy sexuality look like for different age ranges? This is a picture of my brother and my nephew that I am able to include in this presentation with my brother's consent. And I think it's really helpful to think about, because we have sexuality and we experience sexuality across our lifespan from birth to death. And I think when people hear the word sexuality, so often they just go to sex and sexual behavior. But a lot of the things that Nicole and I just highlighted are around navigating our bodies, understanding what is happening, understanding what might feel good, being able to communicate about ourselves, our bodies, our minds, all of those pieces. And so we all experience healthy sexuality across the lifespan. And I encourage you all to think about this question on your own time, because we, the broad we here, particularly adults, tend to be pretty comfortable, at least on the scale of comfortability, which is going to differ for a lot of us. We tend to be more comfortable talking about sexuality when it comes to adults. We tend to be a lot less comfortable talking about sex and sexuality when it comes to kids, especially young kids. And I think a good example is things like masturbation, which is a really uncomfortable thing for a lot of folks to talk about. But from, a medically accurate body perspective, kids as young as 2, there are lots of research out there. Kids as young as 2 pretty consistently are engaging in masturbation, but it is very different than when we are 15 or when we are 30 or when we're like 80. I don't know. Right? It's very different across the lifespan. But when we're little, when we're 2, when we're 3, when we're 5, that very much looks like I have a body and there are parts on my body. And when this thing happens, it feels different. What is happening, right? That's very different than once we've gone through puberty and so forth. And so thinking about what does this look like for different age ranges is really going to help us engage with people in open, honest, and authentic ways. Another example that I think is really meaningful is how we talk about consent. So often we offer folks a formula for consent. Things like A happens, and then B happens, and then C can happen. Usually that unintentionally reinforces heterosexual relationships, because usually what we're saying is a man has to ask a woman to have sex, and if she says yes, then you can do it. Which consent is about a lot more than sex. Consent is about, can I hang out with you right now? Consent is about, can I borrow something of yours? Consent is about, can I vent to you right now because I am struggling and I need to get this out, and I want to make sure that you are in a mentally healthy place to listen to my venting and do some emotional labor, right? Consent is everything in our lives, but so often we offer this formula. When I was still teaching prevention education in middle and high schools, I used to use the definition of freely given enthusiastic yes. And then I started to think about that and realized that consent doesn't always need to be enthusiastic, which makes it really complicated. But that gets us to the question of, what does consent look, feel, and sound like? And I think it's really important that we're able to answer these questions for ourselves. What does me consenting to something look like? What does that feel like in my body? What does it sound like when I'm consenting to something? What do I perceive consent to look, feel, and sound like when someone else is consenting to me? That is going to get us a lot closer to the skills of navigating consent throughout our lives than just, here is my blanket definition. Yes, when no is a viable option. That doesn't necessarily help me navigate. It helps me know when there are, power dynamics or, other things in place where no is not a viable option, but it doesn't help me understand what consent looks, feels, and sounds like for myself or other folks. So part of this openness, honesty, and authenticity is not just about how open we can be with other folks. It's about modeling really transparent communication so that we can navigate what is healthy for ourselves. It's not about just reciting knowledge and definitions. It's about cultivating skills in each of us. Which brings us to another example, and one of my favorites. Why do people have sex in general? This is my best friend. She let me use this picture with consent as well. She sent this to me many years ago when she was living overseas. And I've used it on this slide for many years, which always gives her a little kick. thinks it's funny. So, why do people have sex? I have asked this question for years. The last 6 years, I've probably asked this question over 100 times of folks. And almost always, one of the first two answers is it's fun, or it gives us pleasure, which my response is, I hope so. But I think it's fascinating that the vast majority of the answers, things like fun, connection, love, these things that people offer, especially early on in the answers, reproduction is always in there, to which I say, that is one place that, or one way that babies are made, not the only way that babies are made. But reproduction is always lower on the list. So if we're starting from these other places of communication, connection, love, joy, fun, pleasure, why are those the things that we consistently leave out when we're talking about sex and sexuality? And I think that's a really fascinating piece. And again, I recognize that there's probably a lot of discomfort imagining how to have those conversations with younger folks. And I go back to let's think about age appropriateness here. So often, folks are like, well, I can't talk about sex with my 4-year-old. And a colleague of mine once said that a good measurement of age appropriateness is what questions people are asking. And I guarantee you, my 4-year-old niece was asking, where do babies come from? When my sister-in-law was pregnant with her younger brother, right? That sounded weird. When my sister-in-law was pregnant with my niece's younger brother. And so, right, she was asking those questions, and they're age appropriate. There's so many tools out there to help us respond to that in really age appropriate ways versus I don't know, they just show up, I don't know, or the stork brings them or whatever, which is right, such an example in our society. There's actually a children's movie called Storks about storks that deliver babies. So it's a fascinating cultural norm, right? But what are the ways that we can start in really open and authentic, honest ways talking about sexuality in an effort to promote skills, as opposed to just asking people to regurgitate, definitions at us, which don't help us navigate what health and safety looks like for us. They just ask us to repeat information.
So in that spirit, on this next slide, we want to just dive a little bit deeper into this idea of responding to young people. Meg, said it beautifully with the idea that if they're asking questions, then that's a good indicator that it's age appropriate, right? I think that's a really useful piece of advice that you were given. And I think we can think about, a lot of these questions on this slide, right? So where do babies come from? I don't feel like a boy or a girl. Is that okay? Why? Just in general, why? How physical should a relationship be? And when is it okay to have sex? And then this one's not really a question, but this, I don't want to brush my hair and I say what happens to my body, so you can't make me. These are all examples of things that young people have said, right? Things that young people might say in response to any number of questions or concerns or thoughts they have around these topics. And so it's really critical that we're talking to young people in ways that are empowering, accepting, reassuring, and supportive of that questioning and that curiosity. Young people are often so much more aware of things than adults give them credit for, and will find other sources of information if they think they're being lied to, or they're not being taken seriously, or they are being judged, or that it's not safe for them to talk to us as adults. There's young people know when we're withholding information. They can sense when we're uncomfortable. They're not living in a vacuum where they're not reading our facial expressions or, feeling the energy that we're putting off. They know when we are uncomfortable talking about something, and we need to think about what that says to them and what messaging they receive when they hear, oh, okay, mom, dad, teacher, parent, caregiver, whatever, is uncomfortable talking to me about this. So think back on these conversations on the slide, right, that you may have had when you were a young person. Who were you having these conversations with, and how did that conversation make you feel? Did you leave that conversation and Google things because you didn't feel that you got a complete answer? Maybe Google isn't always the thing that would have been there for you. Maybe you went and found, somewhere else to get information, or opened a book, or went and talked to a neighbor. Did you go and talk to your friends to see what they knew? all of these things, seeking out additional information, talking to other people, all of those things are normal and they're still likely going to happen. But what matters is that young people are receiving information that is medically accurate, age appropriate, and that empowers them to navigate their curiosities with safety and security rather than from a place of shame and guilt, right? So transparency, openness, authentic communication, these are always going to be more useful and more important than whatever discomfort we may feel as adults who are unlearning the shame that we learned while passing information along to youth, right? We have to be so cognizant of what shame and fear and guilt and messaging we are bringing with us to these conversations with young people, because it's not on them to deal with the things that we were taught, right? They shouldn't not have access to things that they need to be safe and healthy and things that they want, things they're asking for, because of some baggage that we're bringing with us based on what we learned from our TV or our teachers or our parents or our faith community, right? There's these pieces of having to be aware of our own reactions, our own understanding of these different concepts before we try to shape the way that young people are experiencing this information, right? Because that's not on them to have to work through that. That's on us as adults to need to work through and unlearn what we were taught.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, Nicole. And I think it's easy for us to default to the law to find some comfort around that, right? Thinking about the law being a low bar. And I remember when I was doing consent education in middle and high schools, would always talk about the law in terms of age of consent. And it was always a center point of our consent education back in the day when we were doing that. And then I'd have young people say, okay, so we can't legally consent to sexual activity. Why are we learning about this? Which was not the goal of talking about consent. The goal was not, oh, well, you don't have to think about consent until you're 18. The goal was, right, we want you to have consensual interactions with everyone, regardless of whether that's sexual or not. And so that piece around the law being a low bar. And I also just want to offer, right, like we posed a few questions in the section to help us explore how we can cultivate our skills to be more open, honest, and authentic. And I would just offer as well that like one of the strategies I use to help me here is I listen to podcasts. One of the ones that I listen to is Savage Love, which is an imperfect advice, sex, relationship, love advice podcast. And one of the reasons I listen to it is that folks call in and ask questions about their own experiences. And so often they are outside of my scope of my understanding of what is healthy sexuality for me. And so it helps me explore and think and learn. And when someone calls in to ask a question, I can hear not only the host's response, but I can also then think about how might I respond if I were to get that question from a client or a participant or, something. How would I engage with that in a way that was meaningful, that promoted skills, and that centered openness, honesty, and authenticity?
I love that, Megan. I also want to add another strategy here to offer. So when I was a CPS worker, like I said, I would have these conversations with parents who were asking me, what do I do? How do I handle this when it came to oftentimes navigating disagreements around things like social media, right? But the thing that I think is really applicable here to this conversation is this idea of being curious about youth culture, right? As we get older and get more and more detached from what our young people are interested in, what they care about, what they're doing, the language they're using, how they are navigating the world, we really do ourselves and them a disservice by not taking an interest in youth culture and trying to stay up to date. Maybe not, with all the lingo. It's a fast changing world. I think as a young professional, I still find myself sometimes asking, what does that mean? But that's the thing, right? That's the strategy, is asking, what does that mean? What does this mean to you? Why is this something that you're, watching or listening to? Why does it matter to you? And not from a place of, well, why are you listening to that, right? It's got to be, what's the value that you see in this? How can I understand why this is important to you? To really help us understand how to talk to young people and how to be connected to the world that they are living in right now, because it is so fast changing, especially with the technology that they have access to. It's just a different world, and we can no longer afford, to just be the generation above that isn't tapped into what's happening with the generation below, because more and more the generational divide is happening due to technology, right? So we have to be tapped in, we have to be listening, we have to be open to learning and understanding and doing those things. Taking an interest in young culture, youth culture, is really critical for creating a space where young people feel valued and like they can ask questions and get answers because they know that you care about what happens to them.
Absolutely. And I think, whether folks are working with young people or adults, promoting these skills with adults as well. If you're doing, prevention programming, askable adult workshops, Planned Parenthood does a lot of those that are really great. So how can we cultivate these skills as adults? And thinking back on recording too, when we were talking about different forms of oppression, what are the ways in which our ageism or adultism might be erasing or ignoring the expertise that young people have? Because they do. And so looking for those opportunities to learn across generations is so meaningful, and can really help empower folks. So that kind of brings us to our third health promotion skill we want to offer you today, which is positive framing. So often, again, that we are really comfortable talking about what abuse is, what it looks like, and how problematic it is in our communities. But one of the things that often does is it falls short on giving us a direction to go and a change that we can make. And so we might say things like child sexual abuse is an epidemic in our community and must be stopped, which is absolutely true, but doesn't really give us a next step there. And so coupling that with saying or focusing in on instead something like everyone has a role in promoting healthy sexuality, interactions, and relationships gives us an opportunity and a direction to go in. Similarly, we might say things like consent is about partners not having to do things that make them uncomfortable. Absolutely true. But again, if we're really getting into that promotion piece, we might want to lean more into consent lets people express what they want, like, need, and what gives them pleasure. I had someone in a presentation last week when we were talking about this ask, but what if someone doesn't know what gives them pleasure yet? What if they're young and they haven't explored these things? Consent lets us do our exploration in safe and healthy ways as well, right? Whether that is exploring boundaries within a friendship or a new relationship, or exploring boundaries or what gives us pleasure or what we need in our sexual relationships at some point in our lives, right? And so consent is a really important piece. And if we're just saying consent is about not causing harm, we're missing the skill development. We're missing the opportunity to cultivate skills and help folks navigate what is healthy or safe for them. And so again, regardless of whether or not you are working with young people or adults, there's so much opportunity for health promotion to be tools that we use, and it's necessary if we're ever going to get towards that vision of a healthier and safer community and society for all people, especially young people.
Yes, thank you for that. So in that spirit of, positive reframing, we also just want to take a moment here to think about using an anti-oppression framework as a way to use positive framing, right? So we've talked about, when we're thinking of prevention, that means that we are addressing the root causes of abuse. So this is why we want to use an anti-oppression framework in the prevention field. And you've all learned about oppression in the last video here, so we have a good basis for what we're talking about. When we're thinking about using an anti-oppression framework in health promotion, this means that we're thinking about inclusiveness, accessibility, equity, and social justice in all that we do as a way to ensure that we're not perpetuating efforts or norms that value some people over others, right? The really important thing here is we want all of our young people and all of everyone across the lifespan to see themselves in this conversation and to see themselves as someone who has access to this information that is free of barriers. So much of the conversation that we have about oppression centers around barriers and things that create unequal opportunities. So it becomes critical and clear, right, then that we have to address those pieces head on if we want our health promotion efforts to come with a lens that's applicable for all people, that feels exciting because people can see themselves in it, that feels like it resonates because they're not having to overcome some barrier to be able to access the content or to be able to understand the content or to see it applied to their life, right? We need to be really thoughtful about not valuing health promotion of one particular group of people over promoting the health of all people, right? So what does that look like? How are we, really being thoughtful about those different pieces? And that comes back to these inclusiveness, accessibility, equity, and social justice lenses that can help us be thoughtful in the promotion that we're doing. It can help us really think through different lenses and use, filters that we maybe haven't thought of in the past, or reevaluate the content and criteria that we already have, right? So, content and curricula that we already have. What are those things offering? Who is represented? And who is not represented, right? What does that mean? What are we saying? What is the message we're sending if someone can't see themselves in the idea of experiencing joy and health and, deserving happiness and being free from experiencing harm, right? What are we saying if everyone isn't represented in that?
Absolutely. And so often there are specific populations that we leave out of conversations about navigating what is healthy for ourselves, whether it's sexuality or otherwise. A great example of this is, folks with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So often we leave them out of conversations around sexuality, and they're human beings and they have sexuality, right? And the harm that we do or we reinforce by not including people in conversations around healthy sexuality. And we say, if someone is touching you or someone is hurting you, get help. And that's all we offer. We're reinforcing harm, and we're upholding oppression by not doing our work in inclusive and accessible and meaningful ways. We are intentionally excluding people. If we are only interested in, preventing abuse with the able-bodied white folks in our communities, and we are not as interested in, preventing abuse with Latinx youth that are kept in cages along the border, we're not actually preventing abuse, and we're not actually working towards abuse prevention. And so we have to think really clearly about how our work is inclusive, how our work is accessible, how it's focused on equity and social justice. Because if it's not, whether we're doing health promotion, anti-oppression work, we're not preventing child abuse, which is where we go back to. We have to have both of those pieces to actually end the abuse and violence in our communities. And I wanted to just add another piece of research here that another study that was done found that only about half of all students in the United States received sex education that met the minimum national standards in the United States from 2011 to 2019. So we're highlighting so many ways that here in Oregon and nationally, comprehensive sexuality education and health promotion in general prevents abuse. And we know that young people today are less likely to receive sex education on those key topics needed to protect their health than they were 25 years ago. So we are getting further away from meaningfully preventing child abuse than we were 25 years ago. And because we don't see the connections between this work, and we don't understand how health promotion is absolutely necessary and sexual health promotion is absolutely necessary to preventing abuse and violence in our communities.
So with that sombering understanding, it's really important, I think, that we, kind of come to an ending here that offers us some key pieces to think about and some key takeaways that will offer us, tools to use the information that we've talked about today so that we don't have to think about this, 20 years from now. We can look back at that research and say, maybe 20 years ago, they weren't receiving education, but now look at how far we've come, right? So a few things to think about. How can you model healthy boundaries, healthy relationships, and healthy communication in your work? How can you work to undo harmful norms and stereotypes in your work? When it comes to abuse prevention, we are in a really unique position where the people that we are most hoping to impact are still growing and changing and learning and developing in a lot of really critical and robust ways, right? So we have the chance to demonstrate what it is to promote health and to value health over things like embarrassment and stigma and shame, right? Put health at the forefront and really make that apparent and make that normalized. We also have the power to help interrupt these harmful connotations with the adults and caregivers that we work with so that down the line, we don't have to continue to undo harmful learning in the first place, right? We have an opportunity as a society to really embrace the connections between not only, health promotion and abuse prevention, but all these different forms of violence and abuse prevention, coupled with health promotion, coupled with, all of these pieces of inclusivity and social justice and equity and accessibility, right? That could be a real shift for our culture, for our society, for our young people, and for the adults who exist today, right? The adults who are experiencing the world through a lens of shame and stigma around these things. We have an opportunity to undo some of that and to make it so that our next generation of adults doesn't have to unlearn, and our youth who will become adults have the skills that they need, to know how to navigate their lives in a way that's both safe and healthy for them.
So we just want to remind you all, abuse is preventable. How does that influence the ways in which you do your work and the ways in which you exist in your communities and your lives? Health promotion, particularly sexual health promotion, is abuse prevention. So what does that mean to you in the work that you do in the communities that you work with and within? What does health promotion look like in your role, whether that is a professional, a parent, a friend, a family member, a sibling? And how can you model that in our work? The number of times I've seen folks talk about health promotion like consent, and then in our work, we'll say things like, "Are you ready to move on?" And folks sit there silently and don't say anything. And it's like, well, is that modeling consent? Does silence mean yes? And so, like, what are the ways that we're really modeling? How are we really walking the walk? How are we modeling the skills and tools we need to create a healthier and safer community and world for all people? And oppression is a root cause of abuse. How does that inform not just the way you talk about abuse, but also how you approach its prevention, whether you are doing response or prevention or intervention or any other work? How does knowing that oppression is a root cause of abuse inform your approaches to the work so that we can all find our roles in prevention?
With that, we have come to the end of our third episode in this series. Really, really appreciate you listening and tuning in and being a part of this conversation. We hope that you have found some valuable resources and some, useful takeaways for additional resources on abuse and violence prevention across the lifespan. Check out our website, which you see here on the screen in front of you. You can also find additional contextual information about specifically bridging child abuse prevention efforts and broader violence prevention efforts by going to our prevention page and selecting our Bridge Project page. If you go there, there's lots of additional information, and we'll be sure to link that in the caption for this video as well so that you have that piece. Thank you again so much for being here and for listening and for all the work that you're doing to prevent abuse and to make our communities healthier and safer for all people.